The throne room had been designed to produce a specific psychological effect on everyone who entered it, and it worked. Kralai Sarath had overseen 3 renovations in her decades of rule, each one calibrated to increase the sensation of hierarchical distance. The ceiling raised by another meter, the approach corridor lengthened, the throne platform elevated by an additional step. The room did not intimidate through decoration. It intimidated through proportion, through the precise engineering of space that made every person who crossed its threshold feel the exact weight of where they stood relative to the center of authority. She was the center. She had been the center for 31 years. She had earned it through methods that her official historical record described as decisive, and that her political enemies, the ones who remained alive, described in other terms that were also accurate. The coalition security briefing had been scheduled for 3 hours. The seating arrangement had been specified in the preparatory documentation with the care she gave to all arrangements. Her 7 senior ministers in the front arc, the allied species representatives in the second tier positioned by fleet contribution and treaty seniority, the administrative observers along the side walls. The human delegation occupied the far section, not insultingly distant, which would have been a diplomatic statement, but distant enough to accurately represent their modest position in the coalition's force structure. 2 ships, a listening post, and a medical support agreement that had been more useful than she'd expected, but was still not the kind of contribution that earned proximity to a throne. Their observer was a man whose name she had not retained from the briefing materials, because his rank did not require her to retain it. He had taken a seat in the back of the human section at the session's beginning and produced a physical notepad, which she had registered as either anachronistic or deliberate, and had not yet determined which. He had not looked toward the throne with the frequency that most beings in that position could not resist. He had looked at the briefing speakers, taken his notes, and given the general impression of someone who was there to receive information rather than to be seen receiving it. Lyeth sat in the ceremonial chair to the throne's right, which was where she always sat for formal proceedings. She was 9 years old, which in her species corresponded to a developmental stage the Queen had once privately categorized as approximately old enough for the first real lessons, and young enough that the lessons still required active maintenance. The lessons had been proceeding well. Lyeth held her ceremonial posture correctly. She attended to the speakers with the appropriate expression of engaged authority. She had, the morning of the briefing, correctly identified 3 hierarchical positioning errors in the draft seating arrangement that her staff had submitted for review, and had corrected them without being prompted. The Queen had noted this with something she did not examine as satisfaction, because satisfaction was a state she had learned to convert immediately into its strategic equivalent, confirmation that the current approach should be continued. The mid-session break was called at the 90-minute mark. Refreshments were distributed by staff trained to do this without becoming visible, which they accomplished with their usual competence. The room's formal positioning relaxed into the subsidiary networking that breaks existed to permit, ministers speaking quietly with allied representatives, observers comparing notes, the informal deal-making that happened in the margins of official proceedings, because official proceedings were designed for the record rather than the work. Lyeth rose from the ceremonial chair. The Queen registered this as unremarkable. Breaks permitted movement. Lyeth occasionally spoke with the allied representatives' younger staff members during breaks, which was appropriate relationship cultivation. She watched her daughter walk past the first row of ministers without stopping, past the second, past the allied representatives section, where 3 beings who outranked every human in the room made brief eye contact with the heir to the throne and received no acknowledgement, past the administrative observers, to the back of the room, to the human section, to the man with the notepad, who looked up when Lyeth arrived before him with the expression of someone recalibrating their expectations, and then looked up further when Lyeth sat down. Not in a chair. There was no chair beside him, simply on the floor, cross-legged, with the matter-of-fact positioning of a child who had decided where she was going to be and was being there. The throne room went quiet by degrees, the way things went quiet when the silence spread outward from a point rather than falling all at once. The ministers noticed. The allied representatives noticed. The administrative observers noticed. The staff, trained to be invisible, achieved a different kind of stillness. Sarath, who had not been visibly surprised by anything in 31 years, went completely still. The man with the notepad, she would learn his name, afterward, in the way you learned the details of things that required understanding, did not appear to know what to do, which was the most human response available, and therefore the most legible one in the room. He looked at the child sitting beside him on the floor. He looked around the room with the expression of someone checking whether what they were observing was actually occurring. He looked at the throne, where the queen of the people whose heir was currently sitting on the floor next to him was maintaining perfect stillness. He did not ask Lyeth to leave. He did not call for staff. He did not produce the social reflexes that rank anxiety would have generated in most beings in his position. The deflection, the gentle redirection, the nervous performance of someone trying to manage a situation that exceeded their clearance. He looked at Lyeth for a moment, and Lyeth looked back at him with the direct attention of a child who has made a decision and is not reconsidering it, and he returned to his notepad. This was, the queen thought, either the most composed response available or the most oblivious, and she was not yet certain which. The room remained quiet with the specific quality of quiet that indicated collective breath-holding. Her ministers were performing the diplomatic version of not looking at something, eyes slightly too fixed on their own affairs, bodies angled with excessive deliberateness away from the back section. The allied representatives were less practiced in this, and several of them were simply watching with open curiosity. The human delegation members near the back had the expressions of people who had identified a situation and were calculating their own proximity to it. None of them spoke. None of them looked at the queen directly, which was the correct instinct. She had taught Lyeth correctly about that, at least. The break continued for another 6 minutes. For 6 minutes, the heir to the throne sat on the floor of her mother's throne room beside a low-ranking human military observer. And the low-ranking human military observer took notes and occasionally said something quiet that the room's acoustics did not carry to the throne. And Lyeth listened with the focused attention she had been trained to deploy toward things that mattered. When the session resumed, the briefing coordinator, with the carefully neutral expression of someone being paid to manage the unmanageable, indicated that proceedings would continue. Lyeth did not return to the ceremonial chair. The queen said nothing. The briefing continued around the immovable fact of the heir to the throne sitting beside a human she had decided to sit beside, and every subsequent speaker navigated the visual of it with varying degrees of success. And the man with the notepad continued taking notes, and the throne room's careful hierarchy persisted in every architectural detail while failing, comprehensively, at its psychological purpose. The queen waited until the session was fully concluded and the room was clearing before she moved from the throne. This was tactical rather than indecisive. The space required for the conversation she was about to have was not a space that could be created in a full room. She descended the platform steps with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had never needed to move quickly, because things arranged themselves around her velocity rather than the other way around. Lyeth was still in the back section. The human observer was packing his notepad into a case with the careful movements of someone who had been aware of the queen's approach since she started descending the steps. He stood when she arrived, which was correct, and held himself with the posture of someone who was not performing calmness, but had found it through the same route people found things they needed, necessity and practice. "My daughter," the queen said, because the most efficient path through a conversation was always its actual subject, has disrupted a coalition security briefing. She sat on the floor, he said, with the careful precision of someone distinguishing between a description and a judgment. "In my throne room, during a formal session." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment, cataloging with the assessment she applied to everything. Steady, not attempting to minimize or amplify, offering accuracy rather than management. She had met very few people whose first instinct under her direct attention was accuracy. "Did she speak to you during the break?" "Yes." "What did she say?" He looked at her with the expression of someone deciding something. "She asked if I was the one who responded to the medical transport distress call in the Varanthe corridor 7 months ago. I told her I was. She said she knew because her tutor had described the responding officer. She asked why I had responded when the call came from outside my patrol zone." He paused. "I told her I heard the call." "That was your complete answer." "That was the accurate answer." The Queen looked at her daughter, who was watching this exchange with the expression of a child who has done a thing and is not pretending she hasn't. "Leave us," she said, to the lingering staff and to the human delegation members who had not yet managed to exit, and the room cleared with the efficient self-preservation of people who understood the instruction. She lowered herself to one knee, which she had not done in any context in longer than she could precisely recall, and looked at Lyeth at eye level. "Explain," she said. Lyeth met her eyes with the directness the Queen had trained into her. "His tutor was on the medical ship," she said. "My tutor, the one who's been sick, he didn't know that. He didn't know anyone important was on it, he just heard the call. And therefore you sat beside him on the floor of my throne room." "You tell me that power means making others serve you," Lyeth said, with the earnest precision of a child being exact. "He serves without being powerful. He heard a call and he went. He didn't know anyone would know. He didn't know I would know." A pause. "I wanted to sit near someone who does that. I wanted him to know that someone noticed." The Queen said nothing. "Was that wrong?" Lyeth asked. The Queen looked at her daughter, the one she had shaped carefully, trained deliberately, held to the standard of the authority she was building toward. She looked at the child who had just walked past ministers and generals and decorated officials to sit on the floor next to a man who had helped people, because it needed doing, and had done it in front of everyone, and had explained it with the clarity that only very young people still possessed before the world's complications taught them to obscure it. She was aware that there was an answer she should give, the answer that the architecture of the room and the logic of 31 years demanded. She was also aware that she had sent her daughter's tutor on a routine medical transport, and that the transport had been attacked, and that she had received a report naming the responding officer, and had read it with the attention she gave to tactical matters, and had not thought of it again until this moment. "No," she said, "it was not wrong." The throne room was empty when she returned to it an hour later, which was the condition she had requested. She stood at its center, not at the throne, which was where she stood when she was performing rule, but at the center of the floor, which was where she stood when she was thinking. The ceiling was 3 meters higher than it had been when she inherited the room. The approach corridor was 4 meters longer. The throne platform had been raised 3 additional steps. Every modification had been deliberate, calculated, the architectural expression of the philosophy she had spent 31 years practicing and passing forward. She stood in the room she had built and thought about a man who had heard a call from outside his patrol zone and gone without knowing anyone important was aboard, and she tried to identify what the strategic calculation was. She could not find it. She thought about Lyeth, who had walked the full length of the room's hierarchy and sat on the floor, and who had explained it with the certainty of someone who had not yet learned to be uncertain about true things, and who had looked at her and asked was that wrong with eyes that were already, somehow, measuring a different answer than the one the room was designed to produce. She had taught her daughter about power. She had done it thoroughly, consistently, with the conviction of someone who had tested the curriculum against reality and found it effective. She had believed, teaching the truth. She stood in the empty throne room and considered the possibility that she had been teaching one truth, and that her 9-year-old daughter had identified another one, and that the second truth had required no architecture to make itself felt, only a distress call, a response, and a child who noticed. The briefing documentation was still on the throne's side table. She picked it up, found the back section of the attendance roster, found the name she had not retained from the briefing materials because his rank had not required it. She retained it now. She did not examine what the retention meant. She was not currently prepared for that particular accuracy. She set down the documentation, ascended the platform steps, sat in the throne that she had raised 3 times to be further from the floor, and sat for a long time in the room that she had spent 31 years building to make power felt. Her daughter had sat on the floor and made something else felt entirely. She was not yet certain which one had left the larger impression on the room. She suspected, with the particular discomfort of someone whose suspicions were usually reliable, that she already knew the answer.